Welcome to Psych Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jessica Rabin, a licensed clinical psychologist. If you are a mental health professional, student in the social science field, or just interested in psychology and mental health, this podcast is for you. Although topics discussed on this podcast are similar to therapy, Psych Talk is not a replacement for therapy and is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So let's dive into today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to Psych Talk, and thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. Today I have a very special guest with me, Shaina Siber, who is a licensed clinical social worker, founder of Affirm Mental Health, the host of Affirming Minds podcast, and an author. So Shaina, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Jessica. I'm thrilled to be here.
I am so excited that you are here as well. I'm so excited for our conversation. But before we jump into that, do you mind introducing yourself, a little bit about your background and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much I feel like that introduction was like a good sort of summation of what's going on for me now. I do live in Arizona now, which is a change for me. I originally am from New York. I spent most of my career living and working in the Bronx in New York, in community mental health and hospital-based, academic medical centers. And that gave me a lot of exposure to doing work in trauma, systemic trauma, interpersonal trauma. Um, in the last couple of years, and I'm doing private practice now exclusively, a lot of my work has sort of honed in on burnout recovery. I'm an integrative therapist, so kind of say like, I have so many interests, a part of sort of my neurodivergence, and just so many things kind of pull my attention. But I think for me, that has been sort of really a center of my work as of late. And I see actually like systemic oppression and trauma very rooted, ironically, to the kind of topic of burnout recovery. So that's been a lot of my clinical interest in the last several years. And I work with a lot of healthcare workers and working parents and people in education, people that are particularly vulnerable to, sort of some of the fallout from the upstream impacts of burnout.
hmm Well, thank you so much for sharing all that. And what we're going to be talking about today is burnout and burnout recovery. So, to kick off the discussion, something I like to do on this podcast is define terms so we all know what we're talking about to make sure we're on the same page. So, can you define burnout for listeners and then maybe talk a little bit about how you came to really specialize in burnout recovery? I know you just shared a little bit, but anything more you want to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of operational definitions out there. World Health Organization describes it as an occupational phenomenon. The premier researcher on burnout, Christine Maslach, has a really a burnout definition that is operationalized in a lot of the research. But I really find myself gravitating towards the researchers who developed the burnout assessment tool. And why I like their model, I probably am butchering its name, but Shefeli and colleagues, is they really look at the multidimensional impacts of burnout. And they have four primary symptoms that they look at. A lot of them that mirrors the work of Christine Maslach. So looking at exhaustion,
hmm
looking at mental distancing. So that can look like apathy, detachment, also that cynicism that can sometimes arise when people are experiencing burnout. But I think fundamentally that they also look at cognitive impairment. So things like that brain fog,
hmm
forgetfulness, concentration challenges, but also things like perseveration, ruminations that happen when we're experiencing burnout. And I think critically, emotional impairment. I mean, I think there's such a emotional regulation piece that happens to us when we are
hmm
experiencing burnout. So really difficulties in regulating our emotions is something that they're looking at as a primary symptom. But even more important than that, I think some of the things that they start talking about are the secondary symptoms of burnout. And I think this is part of the reason it's become so relevant to my work because it, is this diagnostic stressor that I see in
Hmm.
almost every corner of the multitude of people that I work with is that there are these psychological and somatic secondary impacts of burnout that we see. So it significantly increases rates of things like depression and anxiety.
Hmm.
But now we're seeing even things like through our understanding of things like moral injury, which I'm happy to talk about more in some detail, that we even see almost post-trauma symptoms that are emerging in the context of uh, professional ethical dilemmas that people are facing. That was really looked at sometimes only in like military populations, but we are increasingly seeing it more in healthcare and education and political positions. This incredible impact of moral injury that can lead to really, really devastating psychological impacts. And then the somatic piece. I think a lot of people, before they name burnout as like, oh, I'm so burnt out, I'm beyond, they feel it in their bodies. Their body starts
Hmm.
to give them the information. I can think it can be muscle tension, headaches, GI distress, sleep disturbances. But what we also know is that burnout elevates risk significantly for things like heart attack, stroke, things that suppress and compromise our immune system. So,
Hmm.
really inflame and irritate autoimmune conditions and just lead to people becoming chronically ill or developing or exacerbating chronic pain conditions. So, there's a huge physiological response to it. And if we see in like cultural contexts like Japan, which post World War II had an incredible sort of public drive into overwork as like a way for like national commitment. We're seeing the public health, crisis of that emerge over the past several decades. So they even have terminology like the concept of karoshi, which is related to death from overwork. And there's even
Wow.
terminology that they have specific languaging that describes the phenomenon of suicides that are directly related to professional burnout. So
Wow.
that's sort of the operational framework I'm working at. It's this like
Yeah.
multi-dimensional, full body, mind, spirit system change that happens because of chronic stress that is deeply rooted in our work context and our
Hmm.
professional identity. And then how this sort of intersected with my work is working in the Bronx. The Bronx is like a really vibrant community, birthplace of hip hop, home of the Yankees. But unfortunately, it is plagued by a lot of systemic historical neglect, a lot of systemic racism. So when COVID happened, I was a director of ambulatory and emergency services in the psychiatry division of a hospital in the Bronx. And our healthcare system was already under a lot of duress before
Hmm.
COVID, and we were already under-resourced, dealing with people that were had a lot of health inequity that made them sicker, made access to care more challenging, more complex clinical presentations. And when COVID happened, it really devastated our hospital system. The Bronx was like considered a hotspot within a hotspot. Hit particularly hard for a lot of structural reasons that are too numerous to name. But what happened was our healthcare workforce, many of them lived also in the Bronx as I did, but regardless, our healthcare workforce were really depleted. And in addition to just this immense rapid fire burnout and moral injury that sort of took hold of our workforce, people were also, having panic attacks,
Hmm.
their substance use was increasing. People who maybe already had a history of depression or anxiety or PTSD, all of that they were sort of getting pushed into psychiatric crisis while there is these professional demands on them that they had never encountered before. So our Department of Psychiatry and me, part of that leadership team, we sort of mobilized a crisis response specifically for the healthcare workers working in the
Wow.
hospital. So, in addition to my administrative role, I started seeing clients privately, and there was not a one that was not like burnout was not central to
Hmm.
what they were experiencing. And then simultaneously, I became burnt out myself, as like
Yeah.
oftentimes happens. So then I had that sort of parallel process happening. I'm a mom of two. I was a working parent. I was working this really challenging administrative role in the height of COVID. And then also doing this private practice. And it really took a toll. And I think there was a point where I really had like a breaking point where I just
Hmm.
recognized like I was pushing myself to the point where I was going to just like collapse under the sheer pressure of it. And, as we often do as therapists, like we kind of compartmentalize. I was doing good work that was meaningful
Hmm.
with clients. So I knew I really had to start like embodying some of the work I was doing, and really like centering that goal of burnout recovery in my day. And I sort of formalized more of a formal practice because I am so integrative, really looking at well, what was working the most. And a lot of what the work I was doing was based in acceptance and commitment therapy, which is referred to as ACT, and compassion focused therapy. And I really started to put together a model for burnout recovery and formalize it. And that really, really supported me just as like a human being trying to
Yeah.
get through that time. But I was really making a really pretty transformational impact with my clients. So that's what I've been pretty passionate about as of late.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I love when you were going back to defining burnout, you're like, there's a lot of definitions, but this is how I look at it because it did uh, come across to me as much more holistic, big picture. You even brought in like cross-cultural, and I know we'll talk about structural and systemic factors throughout our conversation. But I think it's so important for people to like hear, even if they think they know what burnout is, hear like these are the things that we look for. I mean, you even said like when you look at measures to assess burnouts, these are the things that people are looking for because a lot of people I think sometimes are like, oh, I'm just stressed or I'm just tired, and they don't realize that stress has gotten to the point of burnout, especially, I mean, you just talked about being in the healthcare system during COVID, like people were still having to show up to work. And I don't know about you. I mean, it sounds like you recognize you were burnt out, but I remember as somebody that works in the hospital showing up during that time and just like you didn't have time to think about yourself. There was so many other things going on that you didn't really have a moment to pause and be like, let me check in with myself. How am I actually
Yep.
feeling in this moment? You're just on autopilot.
100%. And I think when people are burnt out, they sort of vacillate between autopilot and intense reactivity. And
Hmm.
there's not a lot in between. And what sort of like shook me out of my burnout trance where I was just so on autopilot, I couldn't get off. I knew like everything I was doing wasn't healthy. I was like
Hmm.
not sleeping enough, drinking too much, eating all the wrong things, not going to like dental and doctor's appointments. I I was like working through a weekend, just like pushing through. My kids were in the other room, like watching Frozen. I was like trying to like get some other COVID protocol done, and I didn't have time to eat, so I like reached for a cracker or something to just like kind of get through it. And I wound up breaking my tooth, and I had canceled
Oh
so
my
many dental
gosh.
appointments because, like I had too many important things to do. There was too much work. It could wait. And I had like literally a chipped piece of my chipped tooth in hand. And I remember having this thought, like, I'm literally falling apart. Like now's the
Yeah.
time to realize it.
Like my body
So
is literally, I'm not,
yeah.
my body was like, I'm not listening. So let me literally show you.
Yeah,
We are falling
exactly.
apart.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Well, you also just mentioned that you use ACT and CFT for burnout recovery, and you actually have a book coming out when this episode drops. I think it's a couple days after this episode drops, called Using ACT and CFT for Burnout Recovery, the Beyond Burnout Blueprint. So, can you talk a little bit about your book? What inspired you to write it? I can assume what inspired you to write it, but I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly my professional journey with my clients and my own personal journey was an impetus for writing the book. But I think also that here in the United States, we are so work centric, and sometimes I think
Mhm.
we're so in it that we lose sight of it. That it's not necessarily culturally normative in other parts of the world that like after you ask someone their name, you ask them like what they do. Like that's like
Mm-hmm.
almost like the subsequent follow-up, you know. And I think as our culture is increasingly evolving and changing, people are largely becoming more secular. I think post-COVID, people had lost touch with some of their in-person community. So work is becoming more and more central and has become more and more central to people's relationships, their community, their sense of belonging, their identity. So when
Mm-hmm.
there are ruptures there, it's really consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I was finding in my work is like we kind of burnout is so pervasive, and so many people struggle, but it kind of becomes secondary a lot in clinical work with folks.
Mm-hmm.
And I was finding I was getting more traction when we kind of stayed there,
Okay.
because so much of like their even their child like people I work with childhood trauma and attachment wounds, like it was showing up in dynamics with their bosses, and their
Mm-hmm.
colleagues, and the way they were feeling threatened. There was just this thread of they spent so much time there. So I think really kind of starting to think more about like burnout recovery as like a clinical target was also a motivation for
Mm-hmm.
writing the book. And the pathways of ACT and compassion focused therapy, I hadn't seen them integrated for doing this work. And I knew we would probably talk a bit more about it, but I just think these two theoretical frameworks um, offer a lot of wisdom, but also like practicality
Mm-hmm.
in how we talk about it. Because I think a lot of us, like the burnout offerings we have, are kind of insufficient. A lot of it I experienced is very like shameful. Like it's like, here's this wellness to-do list you're not doing. You're not drinking enough water. You're not doing
Yep.
enough yoga. You should be meditating. And I was like, oh, please, like, fuck you. I can't like function right now.
Yeah.
Or like change your job, which
Mm-hmm.
is not a systemic reality for a lot of
Yeah.
people. And particularly right now, when we think about what's
Mm-hmm.
happening in our economy, that it's not the like people may be in professional contexts that aren't serving them for a lot longer than they want to be or would choose to be if they had more choices or options. So we have to also
Mm-hmm.
kind of meet people at the reality. And a lot of burnout, I think, was like blaming people for their own burnout. And I wanted to really move away from that.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I had to laugh when you were talking about like the wellness, drink more water, things like that, because it reminds me of when like workplaces, I was gonna say institutions for some reason, but like workplaces are like, hey, we're gonna have like a pizza party for you, and like we're gonna have somebody come talk about mindfulness while we eat pizza. And it's like, okay, we have an hour lecture on mindfulness, and you bought us pizza once for the entire year, and that's supposed to help us
Right.
with our work burnout and stress.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Right.
And you've brought up a lot that work is where a lot of people associate burnout. And in our society in particular, like we are a very work centric society. And I definitely have done exactly what you said, like meet someone. Oh, what's your name? Oh, what do you do for work within the first few minutes? And so I know we could talk a lot about burnout and work. And I would also like to have a conversation around like what other areas in life can burnout show up? Because I think a lot of people are familiar with burnout in work, but are there other areas that we can be burnt out in, and what might that look like?
Yeah. Well, first, I would say that while I focus largely on professional burnout, the entry point to professional burnout is really because burnout dominates other areas of your life,
Mm,
right? So, like,
yeah,
even in a professional context, like when I was at the height of my burnout, I care more about my kids than I care about work. Like that,
yeah.
like full stop. But if you just observed what I was doing and like how I was using my time and like what was occupying my mental energy, like the way I was living was not aligned with what I care most deeply about.
Hmm.
So so one, I would say professional burnout is the entry point, but I would say we can't distance it from all domains of our life.
Yeah.
But I would say there are other kinds of burnout, and I would say prominent ones that we see are caregiving burnout,
Hmm.
just related to caregiving and parenting, but like even for people who are maybe like parentified, taking care of siblings or other things like that. A big caregiver burnout I see in sort of the sandwich generation, people who are taking care of aging parents and children. Uh, and so those are things that come up quite a bit. And then the other one would be things like autistic burnout. And I would say that broadly as masking burnout and code switching burnout. So I think
Mhm.
people who are in marginalized communities or more marginalized bodies that have to do an exhausting amount of work to feel safe and feel connected in different settings in their lives. So they feel like they either have to suppress elements of their identity or overwork or sort of perform certain aspects of their identity. That can
Mhm.
often cause an incredible amount of burnout. And a lot of the people I work with in the context of professional burnout also are experiencing caregiver burnout and also are experiencing aspects of identity level masking or code switching
Mhm.
burnout.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting that because caregiver burnout is something I have talked about a lot. I talk about with my parents of my kids that are medically complex or have chronic illnesses, things like that. But what you just highlighted with like burnout related to masking and code switching, which I think I logically knew, but had never really put it into words. So I appreciate that. And I'm sure for anybody listening that feels like they have to mask for whatever reason, what you just said was probably very validating or eye-opening to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another thing I know that you talk about a lot is structural and systemic factors that contribute to burnout. And I feel like this probably could be a really long conversation. So I'll let you take it wherever you want to go because I do want to, I don't know, really dive into the structural and systemic factors that
Yeah.
contribute to burnout.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's like part of me is like, don't get me going, but I do think it's so important. So Christine Maslach in her burnout research, she has identified six systemic factors that
Okay.
are highly associated with burnout. One of them being overwork. So that could be just the sheer volume or hours of work, but also the complexity of work versus the resources. So I think a lot of people relate to being in like understaffed,
Hmm.
under-resourced work
Hmm.
environments right now. Lack of autonomy is another one. When we see like a lot of micromanagement, lack of control over like decisions where there can be flexibility, lack of fairness. There's pervasive issues of harassment and discrimination and bullying that happen in work environments all over the United States. A lot of them related to racial identification,
Hmm.
sexual, gender identification, even witnessing harassment of other people is a, significantly puts you at higher risk for burnout, even if you're
Yeah.
not directly being bullied or harassed. Lack of community and like you described like some of the band-aid approaches of like throwing a pizza party or something when there is a real void and vacuum of community is a big one. Lack of recognition and of course like
Hmm.
not being appreciated, not being looked over for promotions, things like that. But I think also very like basic things like so many people in our country are not compensated fairly for their work. They're not
Yeah.
giving living wages. They have to work multiple jobs to pay their bills. And how do you sort of over like a pizza party is never going to do it when there's that
Yeah.
level of lack of recognition. Even things like not being having benefits associated with your job, like another
Hmm.
area that can be deeply problematic and mismatch of value. So of course, when we talk about moral injury, that's the extreme. But even if you're just like doing something that just like doesn't feel aligned with your values and contributions, that is another burnout risk factor. But my curiosity goes to like, so why do these systemic risk factors so chronically exist across professional roles,
Hmm.
across work sectors? And I think we have to, think about the impact of capitalism and consumerism in our society, right? So
Yeah.
I'm not like anti-capitalist by any means. Like I have no, like I'm not a strong economic perspective, but I think just in terms of, ACT asks us to look at the context of things. And
Mm-hmm.
when we understand when capitalism is working at its best, it gives a lot of, social mobility and innovation, and freedom and flexibility to people to contribute in a lot of ways that other economic systems haven't been able to achieve. But it also has led to a lot of, particularly in its applications in the United States at its current iteration, a lot of wealth inequity that becomes massively divisive and
Mm-hmm.
a real challenge in the way that power is uh, you know resourced, especially when in our country corporations tend to have more embedded power through our legal system than individuals participating in capitalism. So
Mm-hmm.
that being coupled with consumerism, which is a philosophy that lives alongside capitalism, that gives us the message that you need certain things beyond our basic sufficiency to be a contributing member of
Mm-hmm.
society, to be worthy, to be valuable, to be happy, to be attractive. And the combination of those things really informs our modern workforce and our modern culture and our sort of like broader values as a society. And really kind of, so I think looking at our economic systems, the social hierarchies that exist in our society, and the policies, like how, and
Mm-hmm.
that is can be your local work, organizational policies and our broader, policies that influence us in all of these invisible ways that we can't always name, but have probably some of the biggest influence on our day-to-day lives that we don't even think about often in a conscious way.
Mm-hmm. As you were saying all those things, I was like, no wonder so many people are burnt out. Even just going through the six that you were identifying at the beginning, because like obviously I was like, okay, work. And I know you mentioned this, that we see it across like all different types of jobs and work types and things like that. But like you could have all of those things within the same experience, like
Mhm.
in your role in work. But then I know you also talked about caregiver burnout and a lot of those things. I was like, okay, not feeling, seen or heard or, compensated. And obviously, compensated in caregiving is not necessarily financial compensation, but, you know, a thank you. Or if maybe you have a partner that the partner isn't doing nearly as much, but you both work full time because you mentioned this, like many people are having to work multiple jobs to pay their bills. And, when you look broader, which I also wanted to ask you this question, and I didn't say this earlier because when you were talking about your book, you mentioned something about how a lot of people think burnout is like an individual failure or like you blame the individual. But if you look broader and see all of these systemic or structural factors that are playing into burnout, hopefully for people listening that feel burnt out, it gives you a sense of like, okay, it's not like a failure on my part. There's a lot of things within the system, things bigger than me that are working against me to be
Yeah.
successful.
And I would go so far to say not only is it not a failure, it's a testament to your functioning survival skills,
Mm,
right? So I think that a lot of times like we people come to therapy and they're looking for sort of like a survival guide to get how, you know, get through what they're getting through. And,
mhm,
what I am often talking to my clients about is like, you have well-functioning survival skills. Like this is
mhm,
your manifestation of burnout. And I know we kind of went through this operational definition, but it's broad in the fact that it comes up very individualistically for each person that they can kind of describe their own burnout experience. But like if we mapped it out, a lot of them are survival responses to chronic threat, right? So,
mhm.
fight or
Yeah.
flight is part of it, and we can see that sort of come up. But like, I've been increasingly curious about looking at burnout in the context of the fawn response, like, or
Mm,
the freeze response, or
yeah.
eventually the flop response when people like kind of just like collapse under it. But, you know, a lot of people pleasing and overworking, a lot of that is trying to acquiesce to power hierarchies, to
Hmm.
stay attached and compensated and taken care of in oppressive systems. So
Yeah.
I think when we kind of take a step back, it's like, no, everything you're doing makes sense from a period of like survival, but
Hmm.
you're surviving the day, you're crushing it with that. But if we want to step back and talk about longevity and your long-term sustainability, the day-to-day survival mechanisms alone are not going to work. And they have consequences on your body and your
Hmm.
mind and your relationships that are really what I think we come to then experience as like the phenomenon or syndrome of burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. And so everything you just said there led me beautifully into the next thing I want to talk about, which is burnout recovery. Because I feel like now we've probably like take home the point that like burnout is systemic, it's multifactorial, it can happen at work, it happens in other areas of life, and people are probably like, okay, so what can I do about it? And so like we said at the beginning, you focus on burnout recovery. And
Mhm.
so, what is burnout recovery? How would you define it? And then maybe first steps to take. I know I don't want you to give away too much of your book, but what are the first steps that people can take if they're listening and they're like, okay, I am burnt out. Maybe my tooth didn't break when I bit on a cracker, but I can tell my body's falling apart and I need to take steps to move through this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, burnout recovery is like the terminology in itself is a little tricky because, coming from like the context of ACT, there are some people that ACT is very about like being non-pathologizing and like the purpose of any given treatment is not to like get rid of symptoms. So I
Mhm.
think there can be in this, I want to kind of name that the limitation of when I say burnout recovery, I don't mean there's like a finite, kind of response, like you're gonna like cross a finish line and you're gonna like be free of
Mhm.
burnout, anything you relate with burnout now and into eternity. Like that, I wish I could promise you that
Yeah.
that is not within the confines of the book. But what I can offer, because I think resilience is so important, but it's so overused in when we our
Mhm.
discussions about burnout, because it's I think so insufficient to talk about, especially like the some of the elements of this that are just completely unfair, right?
Mhm.
That I think it's a different way to relate to yourself and show up that is going to lead to more connection, more meaning, more presence, and more growth in and out of your professional life. So
Mhm.
it's going to make you burnout recovery is a way of a series of practices, but I think even more a way to relate to yourself and your professional identity in a way that is much more geared towards sustainability and helps people flex between being resilient, like fostering more
Mhm.
resilience, but also knowing when we need to stop for restoration and like, rest, when we need to be responsive, like pulling in that intentionality. And I think really
Mhm.
critically resistance. Like when do we have to just resist the things that are unethical that are happening to us, like in the
Yeah.
face of things that are incredibly oppressive. And I think we look right now to the professional domain of the legal system, the political system. It's a terrible thing, but I see some people in acts of resistance, like resigning from their jobs because they are just saying there's
Mhm.
not a way to do this in a way that I could be in integrity, or that I will not, I feel like I'm perpetuating harm. And,
Mhm.
um, I think as a society, we need to support the people that are pushed into those impossible situations,
Yeah.
and be a soft place for them to land. Um, but I think those are sort of like those are the messy sometimes like realities of what burnout recovery might look like.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, and you just led into something else I want to talk about is like how can we even address those structural and systemic factors when it comes to burnout recovery? Because, you know, there are probably individual things that we can do, obviously. And in a few moments here, we'll talk more about like applying ACT and CFT concepts. But you just actually highlighted one, like some people are literally like, okay, I'm not working. anymore in this job. Are there other ways that we can address, challenge, change those structural and systemic factors?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I also promise I'm not trying to like bury the lead with like some interventions of what people could do to get like as a
No.
first step for burnout recovery. I actually think they're related. I think we have to recognize that some of our biggest levers for burnout recovery are going to happen at a structural level. If you think about
Hmm.
the work,
Yeah.
our labor history in this country, things like the Fair Labor Standard Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, Family Medical Leave Act, those
Mhm.
are FMLA, as we know, and are some of the most powerful experiences in safeguarding the workforce. Reasons why, like, my 12-year-old son is not working in a factory right now, like things like,
Yeah.
really pervasive problems like child labor that we had. Even our understanding of like a 40-hour work week came from not from like, let's work 40 hours less a week. That came from legislation and collective activism. So there's going to be a lot that, I would say the United States is behind in a lot of ways that we don't have the standards of care a lot of other countries have in terms of paid medical leave and maternity and paternity leave. And we have widening income equality. We don't have universal health insurance. All of those things, we can't extract those from conversations about burnout. They're directly related. So
Hmm.
I think staying engaged is like a part of the ways that we show up and do that. And that is also directly related to taking care of yourself. Like those two things
Yeah.
cannot be extracted from each other. So I would say that, the foundation of the work in the book, I talk about organizational level change, societal level changes, but a lot of the blueprint is for individual application. Um, and with sort of the missions of compassion and psychological flexibility and values alignment. And I
Hmm.
think when we are doing that, it helps us open up uh, what I think is probably the biggest takeaway of the book is moving towards choice over control. We do a
I
lot to
love
try to
that.
control burnout, to get rid of it,
Yeah.
to outrun it, to outwork it. Um, I think on a societal level, we see like control like coming up in all sorts of ways that is problematic and harmful. But when we can access choice by honing in on what we focus on, the meaning that we give to any experiences, so not our automatic thoughts or reactions, but what is like the messaging or perspective we want to hold of anything that's happening to that is most in the service of like who we want to be and the kind of world we want to live in. And then our behaviors, like the choices we make or don't make, or the habits we cultivate. And that's something that we have to kind of like access on a moment to moment basis.
Hmm.
And we can't do that all the time. We have to be an autopilot, some of the time. Otherwise, we just, the decision fatigue would completely overwhelm us. We have to be reactive sometimes to keep ourselves safe in imminently dangerous situations. But the book, I think, is about compassionately getting people back into choice with those pillars of focus, meaning, and behavior, and
Hmm.
in now and like what's happening right now here in the present moment. And I think that actually carves the pathway for more of this collective resilience. And some of it is like we can't do this perfectly. I think there's a lot of
Hmm.
moralistic perfectionism within our field right now, that we have to be like able to know everything and communicate it about it perfectly and engage perfectly. But, something I'm doing with my work is like when people are able to take care of themselves. Like one of the best things I did this year was going to the No Kings protest. It's probably the best I felt. Like to me, that was an act of self-care. But I
Hmm.
had to be like well enough to do it. And
Absolutely.
knowing myself, what I'm actually informed about, what I not that I'm not learning from social media clips from other people, what I actually know really well is gender affirming care. So I could put psychoeducation advocacy out in the world for that particular issue a lot more effectively and contribute a lot more meaningfully to than like, splitting myself into a million pieces, trying to like, serve all missions when maybe that's actually not how I can most meaningfully contribute.
Hmm. I love that for so many reasons. I could probably go on a tangent about my frustration when you go on somebody's like Psych Today profile and they specialize in everything. But also giving yourself permission that it's okay to not know everything. And I know we're talking about our profession right now, but I think this applies to anybody listening, regardless of what area you are in. Like, where can you meaningfully contribute? What do you know? What feels good for you? This is going to lead into a great conversation about ACT here in a minute. And then just engage in those things. Because also, if you're splitting yourself 17,000 different directions, I would imagine this is going off the cuff, not based on research. You're going to burn out a lot quicker
Yeah.
because you're doing a million things, many of which probably are things you feel like you should do rather than you want to be doing, things that aren't aligned with you. And then you're going to like crash out, to use Gen Z slang.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we understand when we're avoiding or like pulling away, but I think sometimes it's harder to recognize when we're showing up in a space of reactivity, right? Like
Hmm.
we're in a dysregulated state and our intentions, there's still values behind it, but we haven't sort of like meaningfully checked in with ourselves to know if like we can show up in that moment in a way that um feels aligned. And, I think like nobody's going to be able to do this perfectly, but those are the things I'm really just thinking a lot about sustainability with this. I think a
Hmm.
lot of people post COVID, in the wake of George Floyd's death, um, spoke up without maybe doing some foundational work now, understanding their meaning contribution. I think I myself included. I think
Hmm.
and burnt themselves out in a way that like 2 years later they stopped showing up, right? Because
Hmm.
they didn't sort of like build the infrastructure where they could like do it in a sustainable way or really understand like how they can contribute and show up in a way that was most purposeful and meaningful and
Yeah,
sustainable.
absolutely. So you've been talking a lot about ACT throughout this discussion. So I think most of my listeners have an idea of what ACT is, but can you briefly describe what acceptance and commitment therapy is, and then how it can be useful in burnout recovery?
Sure, yeah. So I would say ACT is a third wave cognitive behavioral therapy that was developed by Steve Hayes and colleagues in I think the 80s.
Hmm.
And it's one of the main goals of the psychotherapy is to improve something called psychological flexibility. So this is our ability to sort of stay present and open to experiences without needless defense, and being able to be capable of shifting or persisting in our behaviors that are in alignment with like what matters most to us. So
Hmm.
essentially our values. And it's really about a different relationship with control, like understanding the role of control in our lives and that control doesn't work as effectively when we try to apply it to our internal private experiences. So when we
Hmm.
try to get rid of thoughts, if we try to get rid of emotional experiences, there's a futility that often happens with that. And a lot of people expend a lot of energy trying to control their inner private experiences. And oftentimes that amplifies their suffering and gets them stuck
Hmm.
in rigid thought patterns, behavioral patterns that move them away from the life that they're trying to create and the person they want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that reflecting on the things that we've talked about, it innately makes sense that ACT would be helpful because, just going off values, like, and you gave this example for yourself when you were burnt out, even though you value and love your kids way more than your job, you were spending most of your time doing your job. And when we start to notice that misalignment, then we can make changes to get more aligned. I love ACT as well. I use it a lot in my work. And, I know you mentioned this earlier as well with, you know, we live in a society where it's not just so easy to get a new job, like quit our job and get it. And you said something along the lines of, so people are staying in jobs that maybe they don't like for longer. But if we take an act and values, like if it's a job that truly does not align with who you are, your goals in life, you're not going to show up as your best self. You might be productive, like on paper, but you're not going to feel great doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ACT, I think helps reconcile something that a lot of therapists are struggling with, which is, acceptance can be really misunderstood because what it's not saying liking, condoning, colluding with unworkable systems. So the acceptance part of acceptance and commitment therapy is not saying we accept racism, sexism,
Mhm.
transphobia, xenophobia, the mistreatment and harm that's being done to people. But we are also saying that we cannot wait until those systems are resolved to create pathways that people
Mhm.
can live meaningful, connected lives of purpose, right? So
Yeah.
if I told the folks I'm working with, like, yeah, like let's circle back when racism is done, and then, then we can get this
So,
depression and burnout under control, right? I'd be a
yeah.
pretty shitty therapist. That's not a very inspiring message, but I think then we also sometimes the pendulum swings too much where we don't know what to do with that. So
Hmm.
we ignore it and then we pretend that this is all individual grit and resilience and pull yourself up and we need something that acknowledges the context and the reality and recognizes that's why I think choice over control is so game changing and life transforming for me and my clients is because even you and I, we don't have the same choices,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And then people that I work with that I'm a white cisgender straight woman, that I work with people from all different cultural, racial backgrounds, gender identities, different social, physical locations, different bodies, different abilities. We don't have the same choices. And when we
Hmm.
treat people like we all have the same choices and we conflate having control with, unilateral choice, we shame people, we shut people down. And then it allows people that with power to be more cruel because they perpetuate a message that people have absolute control of their lives and everybody has the same access and ability. And it's a lie. But we also can't victimize and disempower people. And we have to help them see the choices that are available to them and choose in ways that feel empowering to them.
Hmm. Absolutely. So you also mentioned earlier compassion focused therapy or CFT, which is the other modality you talk about in your book. So can you talk a little bit about what CFT is and how that is also beneficial for burnout recovery?
Sure. So compassion focused therapy was developed by Paul Gilbert, and it is a integrative therapy that includes like attachment work and cognitive behavioral principles and neuroscience, even Buddhist psychology, to understand the role of compassion in helping with shame and
Hmm.
inner critical voices. And he uses a lot of evolutionary psychology and psychoeducation about the wiring of the brain and how our minds work to help people deal with shame, which I think for can be an incredible barrier to the behavioral change and the inner workings that were, a lot of what we're talking about, right? So like
Hmm.
that, the example I was telling you about, recognizing I wasn't spending a lot of time with my children or I wasn't acting in a way that was aligned with what I cared about most. There would be times in my life where, well, shame would, shut me down. Well, I'm just such a bad mom. Like, what can I, and if it's like I am bad, that instead of feeling like I have choice to change it, I can just sort of try to drown out the shame with
Yeah.
whatever is accessible to me in that moment.
Mhm.
So I see a lot of the people that I work with get stuck in the shame
Mhm.
or rage, which is sometimes like, losing connection to compassion for other people.
Hmm. Yeah. And that makes so much sense as you were talking, because when we think of burnout, I imagine a lot of people do experience shame because their self-talk is, oh, I should be able to do this. I hate the word should, but I'm going to use it. Like, I should be able to do this. Or, why did I just snap at my kids? They didn't do anything wrong. Now I feel like a bad mom, or I am a bad mom. And I imagine that shame cycle just perpetuates as the burnout continues to go on, unless, of course, you notice the burnout and then start taking active steps towards burnout recovery, like we've talked about. But I've honestly never made that clear connection until you just said that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a lot of people are like turned off by compassion. I think when
Hmm.
people are just, like so like just be nice to themselves. I work with like a lot of high achievers and my work in the Bronx where like maybe like being that feels like that's going to make them vulnerable and at risk, right? So I think what I love about compassion focused therapy is there's this neurobiological framework of where we can actually, I think, get people on board with this idea that compassion is not this soft skill that we do just because there is a neurobiological impact it has on your brain to reduce adrenaline and cortisol, to
Hmm.
increase oxytocin and endorphins. Like it will make you function better. It will make you feel better. And
Hmm.
so I think finding a way to do it that doesn't feel so like woo woo and like, like I think some people get repelled like that, especially when they
Hmm.
feel horrible.
Yeah.
So I think CFT does like the best PR branding of like helping people like get on board for compassion. And it is a skill. It's like a natural capacity that I think we're as humans built for in many ways. And our environments and experiences can sort of turn us away in service of self-protection. But it is a skill that can be taught and strengthened. And I really believe in the power on both an individual and collective level. Like compassion is what's going to turn things around
Hmm.
for all of us. I really believe that.
I completely agree with you there. Well, Shayna, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I feel like we've touched on a lot, but I also feel like there's so many more things I would like to talk about with you, but I know that we are at the end wrapping up. I want to be mindful of your time and the listeners' time. But as we are wrapping up, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you want to touch on, or maybe something we mentioned earlier that you want to revisit before, of course, I ask you where people can connect with you, buy your book, and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say for anybody listening, right, the work of Kristen Neff has been really influential on me, and she talks about this concept of the yin and yang of compassion. We oftentimes think about compassion in that sort of like soft, nurturing, way that I think is so important, and a lot of us are depleted, and we need that. We need the warm hugs, we need the uplifting words. But she also talks about fierce compassion. That's like the yang of compassion, and so compassion can be advocacy, compassion can be saying no, compassion can be standing up for the people around you in your community. So I would just say like kind of like that piece. If you feel like compassion maybe feels like corny to you or has a bad rap, I do think like compassion it can be an incredible strength and just sort of like thinking about what you might need in your life, whether that's a little more yin, a little more yang. But my guess is most people need some or all of that right now.
Hmm. I love Kristen Neff's work as well. So thank you for sharing that. So the last question I ask all my guests is, where can people connect with you as well? For you, where can people buy your book? If you're listening to this in real time, you have to buy it in a couple days.
Yes, please do. So, the book is, I think, booking at all the places you can get books. I will definitely provide a link. I think maybe buying it through Routledge is like the best bet. They run deals and stuff like sometimes. So, definitely understand like times are tough right now, but I really do think it's a valuable investment and resource. And listen to the Affirming Minds podcast. You can connect with me at affirmmentalhealth.com. That's where all like my CE stuff is, or at Affirm Mental Health on Instagram. I'm a millennial through and through, so that's mostly where I am. And I'm behind the wall, so DM me. I love to connect with people and yeah, if you buy the book, that would be great. But if you read the book, borrow it, whatever. I really do hope that somebody uses this, and obviously my own self-critical voices do come up in this, and you open yourself up to judgment or feelings of rejection. But that's been sort of like my driving, compelling vision through this is like if one person reads it and benefits from it, I will feel deeply satisfied, and that will give me a lot of meaning. So if you do wind up reading it and you have any thoughts, I would love to hear from you.
I love that. And I'll put all the links to all of your things, Instagram, website, book, podcast in the show notes of this episode. But Shaina, thank you so much for coming on once again, sharing your knowledge. You've definitely taught me a lot, and I know that you have taught the listeners a lot as well. So I just appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to coming on and chatting with me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And thank you, the listeners, for joining for today's episode of Psych Talk, and I will catch you in the next episode. Bye. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Psych Talk. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. Don't forget to follow me on all socials at Jessica Lee, PhD, and the podcast at Psych Talk Podcast on Instagram.